It's a topic that I've given many classes on over many years, because whenever you ask a group of people what would they like to hear about, inner guidance is one of the main things. I'm standing there. We're going to get this set up perfectly now. Everything is perfect. It's a topic that I've talked about many times, but because people are so interested in it. But there was a period of time when I refused to give any classes on this subject because I felt that it was so hard to communicate what was really important. And my final rebellion against it was a class that I gave in our Palo Alto temple many years ago. And I poured my heart out for as long as I could, and at the end of it, someone came up to me and told me how much they'd loved the class, and then proceeded to explain to me everything that I actually hadn't said that was in fact the opposite of what I had just said. And it so depressed me that later I was talking to Swami Kriyananda on the phone, and I was lamenting just how very difficult it was to share the subject and how eagerly and rapidly people misunderstand it. So anyway, I'm on the phone to Swami, and I said, "Sir, I'm never going to teach this topic ever again." And I told him what had happened and how confusing it was for me because I just didn't know how to get the ideas across. And his response to me was, "Asha, you have to keep trying because intuition and inner guidance are absolutely fundamental to the spiritual path." And he said, even if it takes time, he said, it's very, very subtle. And so it takes time to grasp it, but you have to give people the opportunity, step by step, to try to come to understand it, because it is the answer to so much of what we do. So I'm here, and I have accepted the responsibility, and I'm not in advance criticizing you, and I don't want you to be afraid to make comments or ask questions. But what I'm saying is that this is not exactly what it seems. People have an idea in their minds, and what I've learned now is to try to dismantle some of the false assumptions. I've really learned, especially recently, it's been very vivid to me, the last 6 months I've been traveling and giving programs in several parts of the world. And so often, the questions that I'm asked have a preamble, and the preamble is a false assumption of some kind, inasmuch as I should get guidance by seeing letters of gold written across the sky, and since I've never seen letters of gold written across the sky, therefore. But the premise is false, so there's no way to answer the question. And so what we have to work with here is that people have an idea that our intuitive guidance is somehow entirely different than our regular life. And so what we're always looking for is some great break in our reality that gives us this absolute certainty about what we're supposed to do next. And part of what we're looking for naturally is we want this absolute certainty, because we are fundamentally nervous and insecure and not really sure about who we're supposed to be and what we're supposed to do. There is a great deal of the teaching of self-realization in one form or another that has infiltrated everyday life and everyday thinking now. On one hand, that's very, very good. Swamiji would talk about how society is often shifted by small groups of people who work together and develop strong magnetism. I think of it like this. Society flows like a river. A group of people with power, not just random, but a group of people with power, start a whirlpool over here, and very gradually society starts running through that whirlpool, whether it knows it or not, whether it knows why or not. Certainly the descent of an avatar and the descent with a great disciple like Swami Kriyananda, who also pulled together into a community a lot of very dedicated souls, helped create one of those vortices. And of course, one of the energies that has made those vortices is simply that we are in a rising yuga, that Sri Yukteswar corrected what is the more traditional orthodox view in India, that Kali Yuga is going to go on for a lot longer. Sri Yukteswar corrected that. And I'm not certainly going to dispute him, so we're going to assume it. We are in a rising age, so therefore greater and greater awareness is coming. So one of the characteristics, and I've been following this line of teaching for 50 years, which is not a really very long time compared to infinity or compared even to history. It's not a very long time, but a great deal has happened in those 50 years where I am, and I've been coming to India for about 40 years, and a great deal has changed in India. In 1986, the first time I came here, India was still closed to foreign corporations. And you can imagine what a different reality that is. Many of you know all of this. The Gandhian influence was still dominant. 1 or 2 years after that, Pepsi-Cola launched from the Taj Mahal, which in itself was a big story. And then when we came to Varanasi the next time, the small boats had advertisements on the side. And it was the beginning of the very necessary development of India to take its place. As Swami said, it's too important not to stand side by side with every nation in the world. And that's, where we are. But these are the 40 and 50 years that I'm watching. When I started being a vegetarian, now in the US, of course, being a vegetarian then was not so common, I had to submit to a doctor my diet because my relatives thought I would die. He pronounced it the healthiest diet he'd ever seen and said I would outlive all my relatives. Fortunately, I got an enlightened doctor just by luck. Okay. When we first started teaching yoga and meditation in the Silicon Valley, we were the only game in town. If you wanted to learn meditation, you had to come to us. Now you can, it comes as part of your credit card, free meditation classes. It's just like everywhere you turn. This is a revolution. This is a revolution. I was in London recently, and we were hungry, and somebody asked, on their little device, where can we have lunch? Like within the distance of throwing a rock, there were 3 or 4 vegan restaurants, not even vegetarian. This is just the way it is. But in the context of inner guidance, this other thing has sort of started rising up, which is talking about our importance as individuals, which is not wrong, talking about our relationship to a higher reality, which is not wrong, but then also telling us that we have, each one of us, this magnificent destiny that we're supposed to fulfill, which is also not wrong. But some of the details have gotten a little fuzzed, and the devil's in the details, as they say. So it is true that each one of us is a unique expression of the divine. It's a song that has never been sung before and will never be sung again. It's so impressive to me, just whenever I look at crowds of people. We were in Varanasi a while ago, and if you want to see crowds of people, that's a good place to go. I know there's many other good choices, but that's a magnificent one. You just look. I looked out the window of my hotel room. As it happened, I had a window. I later learned that not everyone did, but I could look out the window on the street, and there were all these people, and every one of them, and they were all hustling, going somewhere. I mean, they were rushing along, going somewhere, and each one of them, inside their own consciousness, was a complete reality. They had worries, they had hopes, they had loved ones, they probably had enemies, they had disappointments, they had fulfillments, and each one of them made perfect sense to himself or herself. Each one of them was animated equally by the divine, had exactly the same relationship to God that I do, meaning in the deepest sense. Whether they were aware of it or not, I didn't have the intuition to be able to penetrate their consciousness. I was with Swami Kriyananda in Disneyland in Los Angeles, California. many, many years ago. Disneyland now has become quite integrated into popular culture. But for many years, the founder of it, Walt Disney, held it as a separate reality, really. And Swamiji really enjoyed that. It was very innocent, it was very childlike. It just stood aside from everything. Now it's also become quite integrated and is less fun. But this was in the 70s, and we were there with him. And whenever he often would do programs in Los Angeles. And for those of you who aren't familiar, Swami Kriyananda is a direct disciple of Paramhansa Yogananda, of this line of masters. He was an American man who became a disciple of Yogananda. Yogananda was living in Los Angeles himself from 1920. Swami Kriyananda met him in 1948, and Yogananda died in 1952. So for 4 years, Kriyananda, who was then a very young man, was trained directly by Yogananda. 1952 is when Master died. In 1969, I was a young American girl, and I met Swami Kriyananda at that time, and he was well established as a spiritual teacher. And the fact that he was immersed in the teachings of India but was an American was a perfect combination for me. And he started the community of Ananda, which at that time was one big rural community, which we now call Ananda Village, because there are multiple communities around the world now, so we have to identify. And we mostly lived for the first 10 years, which was all through the 70s, very isolated, wonderfully isolated in that community. But Swamiji would make little forays into the rest of the world every so often to give programs. And every so often he would go to Los Angeles, and a group of us, in this particular case about 12 of us, went with him. It was a big spiritual fair of some kind. But as part of our adventure, we would usually spend a day at Disneyland, because he always liked that particular time. And some of you who knew Swami Kriyananda met him when he was in his 70s or 80s, but he was in his 40s at that point, and he was very strong and very vigorous. He knew Disneyland really well because he'd lived in that area, and he had his favorites, and he would move very fast through the park. We actually literally would hold hands and run behind him. It was just like the mother goose with her little gosling. It was totally fun, as you can imagine. So we'd spent this day, enjoying all his favorite rides and his favorite exhibits. And then they had a custom, I don't know if they still do, what they called the electric parade. And you'd sit on the sidewalk, and then all the Disney characters would come, and they would all be covered in lights. It was very exciting. So when it was time for that thing to happen, we went down to get our place by the sidewalk. And Swamiji, there were many reasons why his company was so delightful, but one of it is that every so often his bhav would just totally shift. So we'd just been like children running through the park and, eating popcorn and having this great time. And all of a sudden, Swami's energy just went somewhere else. And we were standing looking at hundreds of people from all different countries. And Swami said, imagine, he said, not merely loving all these people, but actually being all these people. He said that was Master's consciousness, that you're as much inside of them as you're inside yourself. So I can look out the window and feel some sense of unity, but the Masters, because they are one with everything, they could be inside the consciousness. There's the story of Lahiri Mahashaya, told in Autobiography of a Yogi, where he suddenly starts exclaiming, I'm drowning off the coast of Japan, he says. He doesn't say people are drowning. He says, I'm drowning. And then the next day they found that this huge ferry boat that had been overloaded had sunk. And right at the moment that it was sinking, he was experiencing that. Imagine the sensitivity. Imagine the impersonal faith in God that you have to be able to live at that level. So Swami, we're all looking out at this crowd. Imagine, he said, not just loving them, but actually being as much in all of them as you are in yourself. And we all just went into this mood and sat down on the sidewalk started meditating. And we meditated for quite some time and only sort of woke up when there was a lot of music and noise in front of us. And meanwhile, all these people, I don't know what they thought. They just gathered around us and we're all just like this. It was not common in those days for that to happen. But of course, I've never forgotten like where our consciousness can really go. Now, I was saying all of this because our individuality is extremely real and is extremely important. But the difficulty is for us is we get confused by that concept of individuality because we are many levels all at the same time. Swamiji explained this in a course he created, which was called Superconscious Living, but it's just the basic teaching. And he talked about 3 fundamental levels of consciousness within us: the subconscious, the conscious, and the superconscious. These are clear-cut. Subconscious has a certain meaning in psychology. Swami used it slightly different here. It doesn't conflict with that, but the emphasis is different. Subconscious is everything we've already programmed into the computer of our being, which is everything we've ever done before. So it's a huge repository. And because it not only includes everything that happened in this life, but it also includes everything that happened in all of our incarnations. Samskars is what the Sanskrit word is for, and samskars is a wonderful word. Impressions left on your consciousness by previous experiences. So that we are inclined, that's what makes us unique, is we've all had these experiences and this pattern builds up. That's our subconscious. And it's neutral. It's not inherently good or bad. It just simply is what we've become until now. Okay? And the subconscious itself is not creative in the sense it can rearrange all those different experiences, but it can't actually perceive something that's never been perceived before because it's what we've already accomplished. The superconscious, which is on the other side, is it's the funnel that opens up, that opens out widely and connects us to the divine. And on that level, this is who we are trying to become. And that the reality about the superconscious is that we ever-increasing awareness comes through the superconscious. All we can do in the subconscious, and sometimes it feels creative and new, because it's scrambled it all up and served it to you in a different way. You know, you have eggs and toast, and then sometimes you have toast and eggs. Sometimes you have dal and chapatis, and sometimes you have chapatis and dal. Isn't that really? But you're still just taking the same ingredients and you're just mixing them up in a new way. When people come here and start asking about the different Indian breads, you realize that they're all just different forms of the same thing, you know, but each has its own name, so it feels. And there's a touch there. But superconscious will tell you things that you never knew before, because it's an avenue to greater awareness. This is already established. This is something we don't know. Now, if you think about it, it's easier to run the same tape. It takes a lot less energy to just run the same tape than it does to perceive a totally new possibility. So subconscious has less energy, has lower energy than superconscious. The majority of people on the planet live subconsciously. And I don't mean that they're asleep. They just keep repeating the patterns that they've always repeated. They expect things to stay the same. And in an age that isn't rising, that's easier to do. You live in the same place. Your parents, your grandparents lived in that same place. You have a profession that you've always followed. The children will, of course, follow it. The grandchildren will follow it. Everybody will stay where they're supposed to stay. And it will all keep rolling, which it has for centuries and centuries. But now we're in a time when the whole planet is moving into a higher state of awareness. So it's very much more difficult just to stay in the subconscious realm because the unthinkable is happening all the time. You know, divorce, wars, climate change, children who don't obey, And who don't see it the way their fathers see it or their mothers see it. I had a charming conversation of 2 generations in which the elder was speaking about how the younger doesn't listen. Fortunately enough, they were all loving of each other, but it was like, yeah, this is a problem, isn't it? And there was no way the next generation would see it different because he had opened himself up to new realities. And there you have it. Okay, so the question now, which I'm building toward, and I should say the last part of this is the conscious level is not something in itself. It's the battleground between these 2 forces. Because this question we have to ask ourselves is, why were we born? And what is the purpose of our birth? Is the purpose of our birth to just continue as we've always been? Or is the purpose of our birth to increase our awareness? And there's a tremendous magnetic pull from the subconscious on many different levels, not the least of which is the less energy I put out, the happier I am, that just wants us to stay just the same. But there's this pulsing, irresistible call also from the superconscious, which is the call from the divine, which is the call from your soul, from your higher self, saying, come on, let's get on with it. There's so much more that's possible. Yes, I know you're comfortable and you don't want to rock the boat, and what would your mother and your father think, and what would your grandmother think if, but it's just saying, come on, let's do what we're supposed to do here. We weren't born just to float along. We were born to become something else. And the conscious mind is where that battle takes place. All the time, there's a force that says, put out less energy and stay just the way you are. And there's a force that says, be creative, put out more energy, have courage, step into the unknown. And we're just constantly between those 2 forces. So when we start talking about inner guidance, what we really have to understand is that we have many different voices that I can call myself. And the subconscious guidance is a very interesting element because, and I've said this and I've heard people say it a lot of times, you'll say, well, it just feels right. Of course it feels right because it matches everything that you've ever done. And it just resonates just completely, like drums in an empty room with everything that I've always been. And that superconscious voice, because of the way spiritual growth actually happens, we have to choose it. We have to consciously step into it. We have to have, the nerve and the commitment of energy. But it will not insist. Because we think of the divine and of the guru as being so powerful, we expect, Master to pick us up and shake us and insist, but that's not at all the way it works. It has to awaken from within us, and we have to recognize it as something that will bring me greater happiness than simply staying the way I am. And the difficulty is we fear energy, and we fear the unknown. We fear the commitment to all of that. So all of these factors are always playing together. And so to know, what's really being asked of us, which way is forward, is really the question that is such a complicated question for us. Now, there's another aspect about this, which is a little bit hard to face, but we just have to face it. I'll give you an incident of a situation when I witnessed in Swami having a conversation. He often would have me in the room sometimes when he would counsel people, or at other times where he would tell me things afterwards, because he was trying to train me to understand these things. Many years ago, people get very, romantic. Romance really holds everyone's heart. In the U.S., where marriages are not arranged and relationships are perhaps too casual, a lot of things happen, even within our community. And so there was this woman, a very nice woman, And she was involved with this man, and it was a terrible combination. They didn't get along, nothing really worked. And it was self-evident that perhaps this was not a good idea, but she was superstitious and had this idea that maybe he was the one, was the phrase that she would use. Is he the one? So if I break off this relationship, I will have missed. So she comes to Swamiji and she asks him this question. Swami was very supportive of her and, sympathetic, and asked obvious questions. Like, do you get along? Do you like each other? Do you have shared values? I mean, these are questions that are worth asking. I was once asked, I did a very short stint as an intuitive counselor in our metaphysical bookstore. They had lots of readers there, and they thought it would be a good idea to put me in that position. It wasn't a good idea. This woman comes in and says to me, "Is Richard the one?" That's all she said. I said, "Richard who?" And then even more snidely, I said, "The one what?" And then I said, "Why are you asking me? Do you like him? Is he nice? Does he have good character? Like, why are you asking me?" And then I said, "I'm going to refund your money." And then I said, "This is not my job." So I quit on the spot, But that was what Swami was dealing with, was, let's turn the responsibility over to someone else. So he guided her in ways I don't even remember. But after she left, Swami said to me, he said, she has so many lessons to learn in life. She could learn them with any number of people. You have to be very, very advanced before your karma is so specific that there's only one option for you in order to grow. And he added, if your karma is that specific, you won't have to ask, because it will those are the only options that will open for you. Now, that's a very interesting and important thing to think about. Now, this contradicts the idea that I am a special child of God and I have my own destiny here, but it starts to put things a little bit more into proportion, because I've seen people paralyze themselves, absolutely paralyze themselves, waiting for guidance. And the guidance tends to be very specific. What should I do about this or that? Should I go to this school or that school? Should I live in this city? Should I live in that city? Should I take this job or should I take that job? Should I practice the sitar or learn the guitar? Just exact like this. Now, it's not that you won't have a propensity or a greater opening in certain places, but you have to see it from God's point of view. We've had millions of incarnations, and hopefully by the grace of God, we won't have millions more. We'll just have some more, but maybe there's more behind us than in front of us. And the purpose of our incarnation is not to become a good musician, to become a good actor, to become a great businessman, to raise a nice family. Those are the means through which our consciousness will develop. Because none of those things endure. When this group in California was carrying out an initiative trying to outlaw nuclear weapons, and they were very competent at what they were doing. They had a really intelligent presentation, and they came to Ananda, and they wanted Swami Kriyananda to endorse their program, and they wanted us to put our energy behind it. It was a very reasonable thing to have thought about. No thinking person is in favor of nuclear war. It's just crazy. But this is the world we live in. So they had this presentation, which was extremely well done. And I think it was the city of Chicago. And they had all these statistics and how big the bomb was, where it fell on the city of Chicago, how many millions would be vaporized immediately, how many would be turned to ash, you know, how many would die in a few weeks. I mean, it was just like this, and it was horrifying. And it was all true, every bit of it. And after it was over, Swamiji, first he commended them on their intention, then he commended them on the quality of their presentation, but then he said, if peace is your objective, he said, fear is a very bad tactic. Because what is it that you're trying to create? And this is a tactic that's not going to work. And then he said, though, and this is the relevant part here, he said, in 100 years, almost no one on this planet is still going to be on this planet. And then in his very frank way, he said, whether we dribble off a few at a time over the next century or all go to the astral world in one big moment, he said, as soon as you're in the astral world, it doesn't make any difference at all. That all the details of this life do not in themselves carry over. What carries over is one thing and one thing alone. What is the consciousness that we have developed through the experiences that we've had in this life? And that consciousness is how much do we love, how much do we serve, how much do we understand what causes suffering and what causes happiness, and how much are we aware of our relationship to a greater reality than just my little life and my little ego. And every experience, if you think back on it, is a process of increasing our awareness of the answers to these questions. Because these questions, the answers to these questions, it really define who we are. What we accomplish with our consciousness is very important because we develop willpower, determination, courage, the impersonal detachment from other people's point of view. We figure out how to put out energy against obstacles. We become tolerant of other people. We learn how to love. We learn how to see ourselves as here to serve, not merely to get for ourselves. And the question, so what happens, what I've seen where people run into trouble in terms of inner guidance, is they'll ask questions that God really doesn't have an opinion about, where we have a huge opinion about it, but he doesn't really have an opinion. Or we ask questions where we are very strongly committed to a particular answer, and so when we don't get that answer, we keep pleading with God to answer us. I was in a position like that, fortunately, very early in my spiritual life, where I was faced with what appeared to me to be a very important life decision, and I kept dramatically and continually beseeching the masters to give me an answer, and they remained steadfastly silent. And I've expressed this to some of you. I went to see Swamiji to talk to him about this, and I described the whole situation. I described to him with great passion how much I wanted to know what God wanted of me, and I declared finally, in breaking down and sobbing, that it was so hard to know what God wants. I mean, this seemed to me a mark of my great dedication. And Swami just very casually said, no, it's not. And then kind of like the conversation was over. I tried to get it to going again, and it wouldn't go anywhere, so I excused myself and walked 5 minutes to where I had a little trailer. And it was very interesting to me. While I'm going up the hill, I am misremembering what Swami said. I'm thinking that he said that it wasn't hard for him to know God's will. I say it's hard to know God's will. What my mind told me was that Swami said, well, it's not hard for me to know God's will, Kriyananda. By the time I got to my trailer, fortunately, my real memory had come in, and I realized he just said, it's not hard to know. But I found it impossible to know. So I put myself into my little meditation room and carried on my dramatic relationship with the masters, And I said, well, it's hard for me to know. Why is it so hard for me to know? And then Swami continued the conversation with me, but only inside my heart. He said, because you don't want to know. Yes, I do. Yes, I do. That's the immediate defensive thing I said. And then he said, no, because you're afraid. And all of a sudden, crystal clear to me, I knew exactly what I was supposed to do. But the answer was really simple. I didn't want to do it. You know, I just wanted another answer. Is there anybody else I can talk to? You know? And this is, and why? So then the question became very vivid to me. What am I afraid of? And see, that's a question that God is very interested in answering. Because what we are afraid of is what holds us back from clear awareness of reality. And I mean, it's if we watch, and I've had to struggle against the concept of fear. Everybody has their characteristic that happens to be mine. But there's always, we begin to find out what blocks us from expanding our awareness. And that's a question that God really, really wants to answer. And so as soon as I started asking, what am I afraid of? Oh, just divine insight just began to rain upon me. But I wasn't going to get what I wanted, and I didn't. And it was very difficult. But it was the truth. It was awareness. It was greater awareness that not everything we want is going to come to us. So it's very important to remember first that Master, God, Divine Mother, your guardian angel, however you want to call this, is eager to help you. And there's another part of it that's extremely important, which is the consciousness of the divine is unconditioned. It has no limitations. It has no preferences. It's always radiating purely and powerfully, because we go in and out of feeling that energy. We think the energy itself is not always available. You understand the difference? But the energy is always there. It's we who have to align ourselves with it. So what we want, when answers don't come simply, we have to realize, one, maybe it's not time to decide. But the other question is, and this is a very powerful prayer that God wants to answer, whatever you're trying to teach me, help me to learn it. You see, that's a very different prayer. Whatever you're trying to teach me, help me to learn it. Instead of, should I do this, should I do that? Or you can ask the questions like, how can I serve? How can I love more? These are questions also that the divine is extremely eager to answer, because when everything about this life is wiped away and we go off into the astral world, what do we take with us? We take one thing. We take the vibration of our consciousness. So have we used this lifetime to raise the vibration of our consciousness, or have we been so interested in what am I supposed to do, what am I supposed to do, where am I supposed to live, who am I supposed to marry, how many children am I supposed to have, where am I going to send my kids to school? All of these are very real questions, but they're like and I know this sounds kind of harsh, but it's like when you go to the gym, if you go to the gym, I don't, because I loathe the gym, but let's imagine, I die of boredom. I can do it I think about that many times, and then I fall over dead from boredom, so I always stop before that. However, people go to the gym, right? And they push and lift heavy things, right? Okay, but it's a means to an end, isn't it? It's like being in the gym, for most rational, normal people, is just something that you do in order to give you strength to do something else. Okay? So oddly enough, our whole incarnation it's just a big school, it's just a gymnasium, and we're here to push the weights back and forth, because in doing so it makes us stronger. And if you think of it in that way, if you go to the gym, you don't go in and say, well, I can lift 10 pounds easily, I'm just going to push 10 pounds around. You just don't do that, because that is really a waste of your time. You always push it just a little farther, not far enough that you're not going to be able to do it, but far enough that with just a little more determination you can. So God is extremely interested in our growing stronger. And actually, Our superconscious self is also very interested in our growing stronger. Our subconscious isn't. Our subconscious is just perfectly happy the way we are because it's comfortable, it's known, that they have these pictures of, I think they're clams, and they kind of burrow themselves into the algae, no, not the algae, the coral, and they slowly kind of make this little place, and then they get their little cover, and then they just wait for the plankton to come by. I mean, I do that. I burrow in, in my little place, and then I wait for the plankton to come by. It's nothing to be ashamed of or to be surprised about. It's the two sides of the battle. And the conscious mind is always asking which way and which way. But then life itself has a way of just pushing us. It just keeps pushing us. And we think that something has gone wrong, but it isn't at all. It's that somewhere along the way we prayed to grow. And we might completely regret it at this point. But nonetheless, and even if we didn't pray for it, it's the nature of creation. As soon as the water comes up from the earth, it tries to find the sea. And so as soon as we incarnate in a human body, and if anybody's sitting in this room, which you are, or on the camera, you've gone a step further than that. And somehow the question has started to be answered. So now we have to ask, more practical questions, but that whole context is the most important thing that we need to understand. I'm here to grow. How I grow is less important than whether or not I do things in a certain way. When I made a certain decision, I said to Swamiji, is this a good thing or a bad thing I'm doing? He said, oh, it's just a thing, just like that. It seems super important to me, it's just a thing. He said, whether it helps you spiritually or not depends on what you do now. Because there's no place you will ever find yourself in your life, ever, that is outside of your karma. You wouldn't be there if all of these forces hadn't conspired to put you right there. So where you are and what you're doing it always has to be exactly right. For this hour was I born, said Jesus just before he was crucified. But each one of us, with that same power, can stand up and say, for this hour was I born. When people come to me and they say, well, I know the way I feel is stupid. I know it's dumb to feel this way. No, don't ever say that, ever. You've spent millions of lifetimes getting this confused. And you've worked hard and intelligently at it. And your delusion is a formidable enemy. Don't think you can conquer it by mocking it. Okay? Whatever you're trying to teach me, Lord, help me to learn it. There's also a marvelous prayer for other people. Whatever you're trying to teach them, Lord, help them to learn it. And now, but the other part of it is, guidance is much more about common sense than people tend to think it is. I remember someone asked Swami once with great, how do I know what my dharma is? How do I know what my karma is supposed to be? Swami said, well, if there's a job to do and you're next in line. It was, but sir, what about me? What about all my things? No, just life is moving you where you're supposed to be. And you ask yourself in every situation. This is why Master taught so much about character and about right attitude. We have the yamas and the niyamas. We have the whole Raja Yoga course. We have all these different resources that just lay out for us, what the principles of right living are. Now, the trick is this, and Swami wrote this wonderful book, which is called The Art and Science of Raja Yoga. Even if you haven't read the book, just contemplate the title. Okay, there's a science, which is, even though we're all individual, we have more in common with each other than we do with the staircase or the automobile, that we're all made essentially the same way metaphysically, and happiness and suffering are caused in the same fundamental ways. And so we need to take the time to really understand, well, the yamas and the niyamas is a very good place to start. We need to understand, where is divine power and where is delusion? And then we have to understand that subtly based on the fact of where am I standing? For some people, for example, there's this wonderful story told in the life of Ramakrishna about two different disciples, and they both lived in Calcutta and would come on the boat down to the Kali temple where he lived. One of the disciples was very timid by nature. So they're on the boat, and Ramakrishna, see, after all these avatars are dead, everyone recognizes them, but while they're living, they often challenge people. And Ramakrishna was unconventional, let's just put it that way. And some people thought he was a madman because he was so odd. So when this timid disciple was coming down on the boat, some of the people on the boat started criticizing him. When they saw that they would just get close to the Dakshineshwar temple, and they says, he's just a crazy man. Foolish people think he's a saint, but he's not a saint. All these people talking. And the timid man just sits there and he thinks, well, there's no point in creating disharmony, so I'll just sit here. And so he gets off the boat, and Ramakrishna's at the ghat meeting him. And Ramakrishna's weeping like this because he was such a character. He said, all those people were talking against me like that, and there was no one to defend me. You just stood there and let them talk like that. And then another disciple comes, and there's a big, strong, aggressive man. He's coming down the boat. People start talking about how Ramakrishna is crazy. The man grabs the end of the ferry boat, begins to rock the boat. You stop speaking that way about my guru, or I'm going to sink this boat and all of us are going to die, like this. He gets off the boat. Ramakrishna is standing there. He says, what is this sinking the boat, killing all those innocent people? They're fools. What do you care if you can't keep your temper when fools talk to you? Same situation exactly. But for one, it was forward to stand up. For another, it was to control his anger. So the question is, Lord, what are you trying to teach me? You see why that question becomes so important? And when you begin to figure out what God is trying to teach you, because he will answer that question, because it's what he wants you to ask. It's the right question. Or, what am I afraid of? Or what am I attached to? Whatever these questions might be. And then the guidance begins to flow in a way that's, and Swamiji put this to us also, a great deal of the time we're being guided, we just don't think of it that way. Because ideas just come into our head. And it occurs to us to do something, and we're waiting for it to be written in letters of gold across the sky. But it's really just the natural flow. That where do our ideas come from? Well, this goes back, I didn't quite finish art and science, I wanted to finish that thought. There is a science to it, but we have to be like an artist. Every artist may have the same paint box, so to speak, but it's the way they use those paints that determines how the picture comes out. Every writer has all the words of the language that they're writing in, but it's not like they create new words, it's just that they use those words in a certain way. And the science is the grammar, or the science is how color tones relate to each other. But to be an artist is to know which of those resources is applicable to my life at this time. So both things are necessary, but if you don't know what the basic principles are and really understand them in your heart, really have meditated on the very simple question, what will make me happier? And happier is not the same as ease and pleasure. And this is where we get a little confused. The ego wants it to be easy and pleasurable. The soul wants to be free. And sometimes the pathway to freedom has to dismantle a lot of things that we're attached to.
Could you repeat the thing you said about resources?
Pardon me?
Could you repeat the line?
Which, I'm sorry.
About the resources? So the resources.
I'm sorry, I can't remember, but it's on the recording. Thank you for asking, though. Okay, let me just go back to where we were. Oh, yes. But what we have to do is, okay, this is another guideline for getting guidance. I had this complex dilemma in my mind that was based on my fact that I was born into a Jewish family right after the Second World War. And so the whole concept of being imprisoned in a horrible place has always been part of my reality, and I've always assumed that I would end my life there. I always assumed that sooner or later I'd be arrested and put in a concentration camp. This just was part of my thinking. Only I started talking to other friends and realized that they didn't have these thoughts at all. And finally I was with my friend Karen Gamma, who's been my friend for years. And I just mentioned to her this, and she pointed out to me that I was more than 70 years old. You know, I was an aging female. I was living in the United States. Like, basically, she sort of said, statistically, what are the chances? Like that. And then we both agreed that if I was arrested, they'd just kill me right away, and so I'd never have to go through the imprison part, which was greatly relieving to me. And then we both just sat on the sidewalk and laughed for about 5 minutes. But nonetheless, this had always been a huge issue for me. And so I finally realized I could ask Swami this question. The question was, you know, this is right out of the movies. You probably haven't watched as many of them as I have, where, you know, you're in the prison and then the guard does something to someone next to you. Do you throw yourself in front of them and sacrifice your life to save this person? Or do you stand? I mean, this is a bit of the Ramakrishna thing. What am I supposed to do? I presented the whole thing to Swami in all its gory details. And in his brilliance, he said, what you're saying is, in a crisis, in that moment, how do you know what God wants you to do? Because sometimes, of course, to interfere would cause grief for many, many people. In a crisis, how do you know what to do? And God bless him, he just went right to the question. How do you know what God wants? He said, the only way you can know is if you practice when it's easier. And that has become the other mantra. What am I afraid of? What are you trying to teach me? Practice when it's easier. How do we make all of our decisions? Now, I don't mean that we go so far as, well, Lord, you know, should I have the lettuce or the cucumber? You know, I don't think God cares whether you eat the lettuce or the cucumber. If you take, you don't want to become trivial in your relationship to the divine. I mean, but all the time, how can I serve? How can I love? Anywhere that you're, in any circumstance where there's something real happening, even if it's just going into a store and meeting the people behind the counter, or being on the bus, or being on the street, how can I serve? How can I love? If we ask that question all the time, then when the bigger questions come, we'll have a feeling for how that energy flows. You see? And ideas are being projected by the divine all the time. Swamiji actually said this to us at one point. He said, you know, even when you're at a distance from me, and believe me, this is still true. He said, if you want to know, if you're trying to be in tune, he said, this is how he put it, I will project thoughts. He said, and if you're trying to be in tune, you will receive them. And the ones that resonate with who you are the ones that you'll really absorb, but then they'll become your own ideas. And this is where I say, how many ideas that we have all the time? Think about it. We're just moving through life and it occurs to us to do something. And if we have made a habit of saying, Lord, what are you trying to teach me? And then help me to learn it. And what am I afraid of? What am I attached to? And then if we understand what the basic principles of right living are, if that becomes a habit, then everything begins to flow that way. It's not like we can live according to just any way we want, and then when we have a question, we ask it, because we have an important question, we have no tools. We have to practice when it's easier. And when we live then, see what we're doing then is we're training ourselves not to be compelled by our subconscious. It's the battle of Kurukshetra. That's what's always going on. It's happening every single day. How can I be more aware rather than less? How can I be more generous rather than less? How can I be more receptive to what I'm supposed to learn rather than less? And then the question, what should I do? Well, it'll fit right in naturally, because you'll see it's consistent with everything else that you've been training yourself to do. And the great dilemma won't show up. I think I'd like to try to finish this afternoon's discussion by allowing you to ask questions, because probably your questions will bring out anything else that must be said. Now, bear in mind, of course, this is a huge topic. Most of you know I have a YouTube channel, and I've given many classes on this subject. If it's one that interests you, you can just type it into the little question box, and many choices will come up, because there's every time I approach it differently. So you would find other points in there if it's a particular interest to you. It's very easy to find me on the YouTube. Okay. Oh, just one more, and I will take your question first, but can I hold up that songbook for a minute? Yeah. Friends of mine, Karen Gamow, actually, who told me that I'd probably be killed instead of imprisoned, same person. She's and a few friends spent a couple of years putting together this songbook of Swami Kriyananda's music, vocal music, not instrumental, with all the words and guitar chords in it and melody. And it's also available as an ebook. So there's a little flyer somewhere in the room if you'd just like to be able to see the words. And yesterday we spent a long time on the music, and I never even thought to mention it. So just so you know. Okay. Now, you, sir. I don't think I ever heard your name. Your name is? Saurabh. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So it's lovely to hear.
Mm-hmm.
But there is this huge confusion in the world, actually, from different walks of life. People are either stuck in form,
Mm-hmm.
or they're only talking about formless.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, we are not the body or the soul. And that is that realization and being in tune with the form also and the formless.
Mm-hmm.
That is where most of us get stuck.
Mm.
So how to follow our intuition to kind of become one with that?
I get stuck a lot earlier than that, but okay. Just to repeat it, the question of form and formless as the fundamental conflict that causes us difficulty. The thing about Kali Yuga, which is ended in 1900, according to Sri Yukteswar, is that form, it's an age of matter, and therefore when you're talking about the material world, form rules. I mean, we have the theoretical knowledge that we are all one in the Spirit of God, but it sure doesn't feel like that. You know, just I can look out the window and feel compassion for all those people, but I can't be them. It's impossible. That's why Swamiji's comment at Disneyland was so moving to us, because he was perceiving something powerful at that point. So it's the age of form, and that's why everybody spoke different languages, had different ethnicities, just different religions. It was just all about getting some externally perceivable reality, defining reality by what you could perceive externally, and then making narrow boxes based on that. What we're seeing happening now in higher ages, there's a global culture. And there's a very good book, which I think is available in India. It's called The Yugas, and it was written by Joseph Selby and David Steinmetz, two Ananda people. It's very interesting. And he, among other things, he traces back how many traditional myths and stories in all different cultures that all through Kali Yuga seem to have no relationship to each other, are all similar, because they trace back to a higher age when there was a global culture, and we all knew the same things, and then Kali Yuga descends and we fragment. Now everybody's really upset because languages are disappearing, cultures are amalgamating, just all of this. English is becoming the world language, which I'm sure is annoying to Indians, but it's great for those of us who speak English, you know. I mean, annoying because of the British influence, but you see, look how helpful the British were. Because Indians were educated and raised in English, it made you able to move into the world market in a way that the Chinese or the Japanese have never been able to do. So everything is a dual reality. It was also Master's, prediction that India and America would unite. And since, because of the continent America is so big and we have just one English language, the fact that in this country English is spoken so widely, it's allowed that to happen. So what is good, what is bad, what is right, what is wrong, gets very confusing. So we're moving now out of the age of form into the age of energy, which is energy is not the same as consciousness. We still have a ways to go. And energy, we now understand that matter is nothing but energy. But when we start moving into the age of energy, what we're much more concerned about is the vibration of things. And we're not so much concerned about the form of things. Vibrations don't always match because energy is not the same as consciousness. We still have many different vibrations of energy, but it allows for much greater unity than just form would allow. One of my friends here, when I was first coming to India, when we were pilgrimage leaders, we brought Americans here for about 20 years over time. I was talking to this man who was our guide for all of those 20 years, an wonderful Indian man, and he made some mention about one of his friends had married a white woman. And I thought for a minute, and I thought, oh, that's me. You're talking about me. I have to confess, it never occurred to me that I was a white woman, which I was a little embarrassed to not know. But it was because my energy and the energy of the people I was meeting, our energy matched. And the fact that our forms were different didn't have any effect. So when we start talking about formless and form like this, it's very important to ground our spiritual life in realities that relate to our actual experience. Our minds can get very, very interested in all kinds of theoretical issues. And sometimes those theoretical issues are actually relevant, and sometimes they're just an entertainment, like Netflix or something like that, where we just run these scripts and run these stories. But when we wake up in the morning, the actual dilemma that we're facing is not form versus formless. The actual dilemma is, do I get out of bed early enough to meditate and do some yoga postures? Or do I just lie here until all time is up? And then I just rush out the door without anything. And the abstraction of all of that is not really what the question is. The question is, what kind of willpower do I have? What kind of energy? How much energy do I have? And what's the quality of that energy? How am I spending my time and my money? How much generosity of heart do I have for the people around me? And we can, when you can do this, then you can think that way. When Lahiri Mahashaya, when his wife began to realize that he was not an ordinary man, this is told in Autobiography of a Yogi, and she awoke in the night and there were all these golden angels worshiping her husband, it occurred to her that maybe something else was going on that she hadn't known. And she apologized to her husband for treating him as an ordinary mortal. He answers her by saying, I have been silently working out your karma. Wouldn't you just love to have that happen? You wake up in the night and you discover that your wife or your husband is actually an avatar who's been working out. And it actually happened to her. But then she confesses in the book, it's told, that after a while, when he no longer slept in her room, he was always just with his disciples, delusion entered her mind, and she said to him, you should be paying more attention to the family. And she even specifically said, you need to earn more money for us, like this. And then all of a sudden, Lahiri Mahashaya disappears I mean, just, you're sitting there talking to your husband, form and formless, form disappears, he goes formless. Then she hears his voice from the ceiling where he's levitating. And he says, how can a nothing like me provide for a nothing like you? Essentially like that, right? Then the question of form and formless is relevant because he could move in and out of those realities, right? But until we can move in and out of those, the reality is how much willpower do we have? How much energy are we putting out? How much generosity do we have? How willing are we to make the effort, both in terms of sadhana and in attitude and in self-discipline, to actually change our consciousness so that those issues will eventually become relevant? It's not that it's not important and not an important question, but you have to ask yourself, is this actually the question for me? Because a lot of times, and I won't cast personal aspersions on you, but a lot of times we entertain ourselves thinking, if I could only get the answer to this, then I'll get up early enough to meditate. But the fact is, and here's another aspect of this, when you cannot answer a question because it's beyond your pay grade, it's beyond your vibratory capacity to perceive it, you will never be able to answer it until you expand your consciousness. So the actual answer to that question is do something to change your consciousness. Because continually ask the question does not in itself change your consciousness. You have to rise to the level where you can perceive what this issue actually is. When I first came to Ananda, I came because I was totally magnetized to Swami Kriyananda. I just knew that I was born to learn from him, and everything I wanted to know he could teach me, and I was never disappointed. I had not read Autobiography of a Yogi. I had tried to read it, but I didn't like it. Too many miracles, too much, just I was a very sort of pure Vedantist. I was brought into the path by books by Vivekananda, and later I opened to Ramakrishna. But by the time I got to Swami, I'd been 3 years feeling in my heart extremely close to Ramakrishna. And after I met Swami, I read Autobiography of a Yogi and thought it was fabulous. I couldn't figure out why I didn't like it before. Somehow Swamiji made the link. But when I first moved to Ananda to live there, I really didn't know because my heart had been with Ramakrishna for so long and I had felt him guiding me. But I knew that this was a path dedicated to Yogananda. And I basically knew that to figure that out required that I change my consciousness. And in front of me was an extraordinary opportunity to change my consciousness. But if I sat on the sideline and refused to develop myself until the question was answered, I could be there forever. So I followed what I did actually understand. And what I actually understood was that Swamiji could help me. So I said to Ramakrishna and to Yogananda, you guys figure this out. And it was like as long as a year and a half later, I just woke up one morning and I just, of course I belong to Master. How could I not? How could all of this be true? I mean, I knew they weren't competing, like they don't have like a contest somewhere, who has the most disciples, and I was no prime property, believe me. I think he was probably glad to pass me on, But when you're confronted with a question that's bigger than you, back up until you find a question that's the right size. I'll tell you one more story on that. There's this a famous scientist in the U.S., his name is George Washington Carver. He was a black man born right after the slaves were freed. And it's just such a beautiful story. He was a very advanced saint. But he was born into slavery, liberated as a baby, because that's when the Civil War happened. And his destiny with another man, whose name I can never remember, Booker T. Washington, they were like divinely sent to help this race of people get themselves organized, because they'd been generations in slavery. They didn't know how to live. So George Washington Carver developed many ways for them to support themselves, taught them better agricultural methods. And he got up at 4 every morning and communed with God. He walked in the forest and communed with God. In our elementary school, we do a play every year about some famous person, and we did a play on George Washington Carver, little known. He's really wonderful to lead. There's a book called The Man Who Talked to Flowers. It's well worth reading. So anyway, George Washington Carver is out in the forest, and he says, God, why did you make this world? And God says to him, George, that's a mighty big question for a little man like you. So then George says, Lord, why did you make me? That's better, George, but still a pretty big question for a little man like you. And so finally, now I have to add into this, among the products that he made, George Washington was, he found hundreds of uses for the peanut. And so he says, this is how he did it. He said to God, Lord, then, why did you make the peanut? And God said, now that's something you and I can work on together. But of course, by doing that, see, this is also guidance, isn't it? He was just saying, what do you want from me? What do you want from me? And he had both the receptivity and the humility to be told, that's not really a real question for you. That's certainly a real question, but that's not your question. And that's what I was saying earlier, and this is Swami's advice to me. It's not hard to know what God wants, because he wants us to know. And if we think it's hard, just keep adjusting the question until you get to one that you can feel a resonance with. It's much more interesting than just knocking your head against a blank wall. Okay? Yes?
Sometimes when I seek guidance, inner guidance, and in meditation, when I'm trying to ask something,
Right.
then thought appears as an answer.
Right.
And I get confused whether it's
Right.
speaking or is it just me giving myself an answer. How do I
Right. Okay, it's a very good question, and it was the question is, when I'm meditating and I ask a question and I get an answer, how do I know what level that answer is coming from? Is it just me spinning ideas, or is it really divine? I'm glad you asked that, because that's the big piece that I hadn't really addressed, but I assume it would be asked. Swamiji was extremely bold, extremely imaginative, and also, in a very interesting way, quite conservative. There was a time very early on where he kept money in different envelopes. He probably had a bank account, but mostly because he kept money in different envelopes. Like, this would be for this project, this would be for this project, this would be, and he never emptied everything. You know, when he would start on a project, he would designate what he was going to put into it. He would put his full force into it, but he never threw himself off a cliff. And he taught us that way. Master said to him, you have to be practical in your idealism. When he bought the property that is now the Ananda community, Ananda village there, it was in several parcels, which is how it's done in the U.S., and one parcel was a smaller parcel that at that time was actually not even contiguous. All of this he bought in the name of the society that he had formed. This he kept in his own name. And it was like, we'll put all our effort into making this work, but if this whole thing falls to pieces, this is going to be separate. And he just did that as a matter of course, because he didn't want to presume. He didn't want to presume on his guidance. He was just going to keep it. That doesn't mean that he wasn't bold and courageous when it called for it, but he was never reckless. Because, among other things, we might get guidance to do something, but that doesn't mean it's going to succeed. And even that guidance can be true guidance, because we don't always know what it is that we're supposed to be learning. And it's nice when our guidance leads to success, but sometimes failure is one of the stages we have to go through to get to success. So part of this also is if you have an idea and it seems reasonable, you should always apply a degree of reason and common sense to the idea. If you get guidance that you're supposed to go out and do surgery and you've never taken a medical course in your life, you can kind of suspect that there's something a little wacky here and you haven't quite heard it properly. It may still be guiding you somewhere, but it might not be literal. So sometimes people feel because true guidance is beyond reason, they decide that it's not subject to reason. Do you understand the difference? Just because it's bigger than reason doesn't mean that the more unreasonable it is, the more true it is. Sometimes a lot of this is our own desire for the dramatic rather than for the actual work of manifesting things. That the way I think about it myself is we're enamored with the stars and we're quite uninterested in our feet. But to get to the stars, we have to start walking. And if you're only walking, looking up here, you'll just bump into things and fall over. So you also have to say, Swamiji he had more right than anyone I've ever known, to claim divine guidance. He almost never did. He would just say to us, what do you think? Does this seem like a good idea? These are why it might work. Do you have any sense of why it wouldn't work? And he would listen very closely to what we said. He didn't always do what we said. He often disregarded us. In one particular case, actually we were in the middle of litigation when this happened, and he was refusing to answer questions because it contradicted what Master's instructions to him were. I've written it up in Lightbearer, it's very confusing. It was a huge dramatic moment. He takes us out to a restaurant, was about 6 of us, and he says, well, what do you think? Should I let them put me in prison for not answering, or should I answer these questions? And, it was like, what? You're asking us? And later on, and we all came to the conclusion that he should not go to jail. He should answer the questions. And afterwards, someone asked him the obvious question, were you actually turning the decision over to us? He said, oh, no, of course not. But he said, I just wanted to know if any of you could think of something that I hadn't thought of. And you see how relaxed that was? It just like he just wanted the truth. He didn't want to be right. He didn't want to have this special relationship. If Swami had ever imposed upon us that he had a special relationship with Master that none of us could access, it would have completely disempowered us. Totally. So what you have to do when you get an idea is if it makes sense to you, then take a step. Take 2 steps. See where it goes after that. But one of the things that people do with guidance, which is very unfortunate, the very nature of intuitive guidance is that it's very subtle. It is formless. It's not form, to use those words, okay? And it's very mutable. It's like the energy changes and then the form of that energy shifts again. But what people do is, I was told this is what I'm supposed to do. And then we start, marching along with the idea, this is my guidance. And we forgot to ask again. I did this project from a year and a half trying to make our rural community into a California city. It's a complicated story, but it was fun. And we failed miserably, but I worked on it for 18 months. We were totally mistreated by the county. They broke the law and considered our religion, and they shouldn't have done that. I can do it, right? Well, the way it actually was, I'm taking this television crew up to talk to Swami the morning after the big hearing. I'm telling them the whole way that we're going to go to court, that we've been mistreated, this isn't right. We get to Swami, and we had no telephones in those days. He says to them, I have a scoop for you if you'll give me a few extra minutes. I say to Jyotish, who was standing there, what's he talking about? Jyotish says, you don't know. I said, no, I don't know. So Swami sits down, and he basically tells the people that, no, we're dropping it. We're not going to court. We're not doing any of this. That we were mistreated, but it was the right decision. Just like in front of me. For 18 months, I've been fighting this fight. I'm the front of the ship, this whole thing. So then I have to drive back down the hill with these people telling them, of course we're not going to go on. Why would we go to court? But they were from the state capital of California. They dealt with politicians all the time. They didn't even notice. I just shifted over, and then I finally said goodbye to them. I get back in the car. I go beetling up to Swami's house. What? He said, well, he smiled so sweetly. He said, I couldn't reach you. There was no way to reach you. I said, so what is this? He said, well, I was meditating this morning, and I presented the situation to Master. He told me we'd done enough. We should stop. My next question was, why didn't he tell me? I'm the one who's working on this project. And then Swami, in his way, said, did you ask? I said, no. I just assumed that the guidance for today was the same as yesterday. Even though tremendous things had happened. It's not like you have to ask the question every 6 minutes. But tremendous things had happened, and it didn't occur to me to ask. I said, oh. There was no defense at that point. I just laughed. I said, okay, that's what we're doing. Guidance is very subtle. You might be guided to go 100 miles this direction, but then you need to make a strong left turn. And if you've decided that your guidance is to go this way, and you've dogmatized that, you've taken the formless and made it into form, you'll get yourself in trouble. But if you don't respond out of anxiety and cowardice, you'll also never find out what's true. And so there's all these different levels. There's these different levels of where does the guidance come from. Then the second level is what do you do with it? I had a very clear intuition once about what we ought to do with the project. Just came into my head just like that, in the way I've come to trust. But then I started being an arrogant twit about trying to get everyone else to agree with me. And they weren't about to. And so finally I realized, and I wrote to everyone in the project, even if my guidance was true, I said, I've become so egoically involved in it that I can see that it's not right to insist. And so I resigned from the decision making, and everybody calmed down and made exactly the decision I'd suggested. So it was a very interesting case of the fact that I was correct. I'd correctly received the intuition, let's put it that way. But I acted on it in such an egoic way as to pollute it and to ruin it. So this is not a simple subject. And we have to constantly, you forget to keep checking in. That's why Swami also said, you don't have to constantly ask, is it a good idea to help people? Should I practice Kriya? Should I be a nice person? Should I raise my children? You don't have to ask. Some questions are self-evident. But what are you trying to teach me? How can I best learn it? We have to ask that every day. And again, you see, this has to become the way you live, not just the way you act. So if your guidance, whatever it is, even semi-superconscious guidance or even subconscious guidance isn't an ideal worth acting on. It's not like we can all hold out for the gold standard. We're just not going to get it. And energy has its own intelligence. It's a phrase Swami uses. You start putting out energy, you start having experiences that teach you, and the flow of energy itself begins to awaken you. Because if it's the best idea you've gotten, and as Swami said, it's not absolutely crazy, he said, and sometimes any action, any decision, sort of absolute madness is how he actually put it, is better than continuing to ask, what should I do, what should I do? So don't be too nervous. If you're sincere, God will straighten you out. That's the other thing about it. If you're sincere and sincerely want to know, something will happen. And you also trust that flow. Okay? And then what happens is, you get enough experience that you can begin to tell the difference. And you'll never be able to tell the difference until you have the courage to move with it. And then afterwards, you begin to get, like I referred to, you just begin to, it feels a certain way, and your own history has shown you that this is likely to bring good results. And then sometimes you think it's right, and it turns out to be a catastrophe. And then you can either look back and see how you polluted it, or you can see how it didn't really quite feel right at the beginning, or you can say, I know it was intuition, and if this is what's happened, this must have been what was supposed to happen. Because mere success is not necessarily a sign, and mere defeat is not necessarily a sign. Because the point is, how can I learn what I'm supposed to learn? Okay? Good question. I'm glad you asked. This is what makes it so much fun. And then you get to the point where you just sometimes, and in my own life, it only happens occasionally, I just know this one's going to work. I can just feel it. I was in a very controversial project once that everybody was calling Swami about it and this and that. And he called me and he said, I have my doubts about what you're doing. I said, oh, but Swamiji, I don't, because, and I said, it came to me in that way. And he said, oh, well, then of course you have to do it. Because he knew that when that kind of a feeling comes, you have to follow through, even if it's a catastrophe. But you earn the right to say that. And I claim it very rarely, because it's most of the time, it just seems like a good idea. Let's try it. Okay? Another question?
Also online,
Oh, Abhiruchi. Okay.
If you intuitively know that it is time for you to dedicate your life to a life of service, giving up your work in the material world, but your worldly responsibilities are holding you back, how does one resolve this conflict?
If you intuitively feel that you're supposed to give up everything for God, but you have responsibilities that contradict your ability to do that, I have to challenge the premise, because you have to be very, very careful about thoughts like that. Of course, we find ourselves in situations we wish we weren't in. And we find the spiritual justification for escaping from those situations. And sometimes that is actually the right thing to do. And there's many, but you need to be pretty sure. And you can also continually offer that to Divine Mother and see if the doors open. And you can also just start right where you are. How can I serve more? How can I love more? Right where I'm standing. The number of times that a person is really supposed to throw over the apple cart, abandon what's expected of you, and wander off to serve God, it doesn't happen as often as we would like it to happen. And it's just, even Lahiri Mahashaya with Babaji, it was the divine plan that you would be a householder with modest responsibilities before this Kriya Yoga Dharma was reawakened within you. He had children, he had a wife who at the beginning was not involved with what he was doing. He worked as an accountant for the British government. It's not a very dramatically interesting job, just on its own. So he's there for a purpose. So all I would say is take it very slowly and constantly be checking in with your guidance and pay attention to the people around you. And here's another point that's important. Cultivate relationships with people whose impersonal wisdom you can trust. People who have a more clear impersonal view of you than you have of yourself, and who have a balanced understanding of the spiritual path. This is all you do this way in advance. You look for people whose advice and friendship and wisdom you can trust. You practice doing what they say and see how it turns out, so you have some traction by the time bigger issues come. People also often have the idea that the only person who can get guidance about me is me. And that is a great misunderstanding, because sometimes the last person who can get guidance about me is me, because I have so many conflicting cross currents of fears and desires. Whereas somebody who's, 2 feet outside of me, and if God can speak to me, he can also speak to my friends. There's no limit here. And they can be a much wiser channel for me often than I can be. So before one takes any such a radical step, one needs to be extremely sure of one's ground. And so I would say, take it an inch at a time, and don't start with the premise, I know this is what I'm supposed to do. Start with the premise that I'm having a call to be more dedicated. You know, what can I do? And again, this is the stars in the sky and the feet, which I didn't actually finish that. People get an image. Maybe they have a meditation, maybe it's a superconscious meditation, maybe it's not. But they have an image of the possible, or they have an astrologer, or they have a horoscope, or whatever it might be. That's the same. I mean, a psychic who tells you, and you know, that you're destined to make money, to serve the spiritual work, that you're destined to become a healer, that you're supposed to write books, you know, all these different things. And people will come and bring this to me. So-and-so said, I felt great. I said, what are you doing now about that? So what kind of healing are you interested in? The mind, the body, the spirit? What kind of healing? Oh, I'm just supposed to be a healer. What kind of books do you want to write? You know, are you interested in philosophy? Are you thinking about a novel? Do you want to be a journalist? I'm supposed to be a writer. You know, like, not where are you there? Where are your feet? You know, have you studied writing? Have you studied healing? Have you learned astrology, if that's your destiny? Are you training with someone? Just because you see the end of the book does not mean that all those long pages of your life in between can just be skipped. And many grand visions turn into nothing. Not because the vision itself wasn't even true, but because the dull, hard, step-by-step work is not as attractive as the vision. And so if one feels one needs to then, standing right where I am without risking everything in some reckless move, how can I move toward what I'm talking about? Do I meditate regularly? Do I serve? Do I give money? Do I study? You know, or do I just vaguely want this? Ground it. Where am I standing? What can I do? And that's where most aspiration, you know, the number of people who aspire to do things and the number of people who accomplish, the difference is willpower and discipline. Right. And humility, which is to say, well, I need to learn how to do this. I can't just be, and it might be exactly who you are, but still there's this huge necessity to bring yourself to that, not merely to assume it will be handed to me. Okay? The second question.
How do I, the mind is playful and constantly plays games. How do I distinguish between intuition and wishful thinking?
The question is the difference between intuition and wishful thinking. Oh, that's not so easy. Because wishful thinking is so entertaining. And it's but it's the same question as the other one that I answered. Do something about it. Wishful thinking is thinking. See, and this is again where the more popular some of these ideas get, the worse it gets. Because people don't like to talk about discipline and hard work and years of effort and, you know, sacrifice and all of those things. They prefer to talk about affirmation and visioning, and all of that is true. I don't want to say that it isn't, but I mean, Swamiji would always say, every time we'd have our spiritual renewal week in the summer, he would announce to us that there would be 200 people coming. This was at the time when we would have 35 people coming to an event. And he would announce that 200 people were going to come this year, or he would say, this book is going to be a bestseller, or this song is really going to go everywhere. And he said to me, he said, people think I'm a dreamer. He said, they don't realize, he said, if they all put out as much energy as I did, these things would come true. He said, if I didn't affirm that 200 would come, we wouldn't have even had the 35. So there is something else going on in terms of magnetism and energy and faith and powers. That's true. But Swamiji worked hard every single day. He put out a tremendous amount of energy on a very practical level. And he matched that with a big vision, but we're, too many of us, too attracted to the vision. How you can tell the difference is, what am I doing? What am I motivated to do? Wishful thinking is just talking about the end result. Actual intuitive response is to say, what is the next step, and let me start. Just like that. Swamiji, when they wanted to build a monastery for the men, when he was still living in Mount Washington, it was a hundreds of thousands of dollars project. Well, he just started importing harmoniums. Not that he could make enough money importing harmoniums to build a building, but he thought, well, let me just try to earn some money. And he knew that they weren't proportional, but he put out what energy he had access to, and then somebody donated the money. And Swamiji thought to himself, there was a relationship there between what I was doing, because I did what I could, and then the divine filled in. So the way you can tell whether you yourself are just wishful thinking is to ask yourself, am I putting out any energy? Is that energy concentrated and focused, or am I just hoping that it'll come about? These are hard questions. This is why the subject is so complicated, because it requires a lot more self-honesty than some of us are used to putting out. Okay? Any other questions? Anyone else dare? Yes.
You mentioned something earlier about one of the options being this just feels right, because
Yeah.
it's comfortable, you've done it 100 times probably, and there could be the silent voice that scary, hairy,
Yeah.
audacious goal or whatever. So would it be true to say that given a choice, always go with the difficult option?
No. The question is, should we always go with the difficult option so that we can avoid the... No, because harder is better. No. That's one of the great misunderstandings we have. I loathe this idea. It's terrible. I have no talent for it. I can't stand the idea. It must be God's will. Swamiji actually, the only way I can think of it is I remember it. I feel like he pleaded with me. This is what he said. Asha, God does not want you to be unhappy. He said, that's your imposition. That's not true. God wants you to be happy. So on one hand, feels right, but I constantly say, well, I don't know yet. I can't feel what's right. I say it constantly, making decisions about where I'm going to travel, what I'm going to do, how I'm going to spend the summer, because feeling is intuitive, but feeling is calm. Intuition is calm feeling, not agitated feeling. So again, this goes back to, you have to practice all the time. We have to practice all the time calming the restless, I want, I don't want, I'm afraid, I'm not afraid. You cannot say the harder is the better, because the energy flows better if it's natural to you. When Swamiji first came to Master put him into construction, building. And Swamiji said he just had absolutely no talent for it. He said if he had to hammer a nail in, he would hit around it for like 6 or 7 times and then hit his thumb and then hit the nail. And he was several months on this building site. They were building, I think, India Hall in Hollywood Church. And at the end of it, when Master finally took him off of it, Swami said to the foreman, I sure learned a lot on this job. And the foreman said, did you? It's just like, because he had no talent for it, but he was an eager disciple. Then Master had him start reviewing people's quizzes for the lessons, counseling people, answering the letters, and Swami, just all his energy flowed for that. And it's easier to feel God's flowing energy when what you're doing is natural to you. So our talents and inclinations, and I'm glad you asked this, and even our preferences, they're not necessarily, they're often given to us because that is the way we're supposed to go. This is what I love. And if we already love something, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're being subconscious in continuing with it. It's that I was born for this, and I was brought up for this, and this is the karma that is flowing. You can't be superstitious like that. the fact that you like it doesn't mean that it's necessarily right, but so is the fact that I don't like it means that it's necessarily right. That's where you have to constantly ask the question, what are you trying to teach me? And how can I best learn it? You know, and a lot of us, you know, gradually, one of the ways that Swami brought us up, you know, through our youth was to go with our strengths. Very often you do much better going with your strengths because then the energy will flow. If this is my natural inclination, the energy flows. And if energy is flowing, it's just easier to learn things. And then often, as the energy flows, you'll gain the confidence and the strength to then take on the harder things. Swami put me out to talk. He wanted me to write from my 20s. He wanted me to stay in my house and write. Not a chance. I just couldn't do it. Absolutely impossible. So he said, well, you're comfortable talking, so I'll put you out to talk. And then you'll gain confidence, which was, you know, and now I have actually written a few books, but for decades I never wrote a book. I just talked. And the whole talking was meant to be to give me the energy to write from the karmic perspective. But it took me decades going with my strengths to overcome my fears so that I could face into the ones that were difficult. So that's often also how it works. There's no rules. There's no rules.
Intuition coupled with wisdom.
With what?
With wisdom.
With wisdom, common sense. Common sense is a huge part of it, really. Swami just would never have a chance as a builder. It would just be a complete waste of his talent. So just because it's hard doesn't mean it's right. God doesn't want you to be unhappy. We're meant to be happy. And so what we have to do is refine our capacity for happiness, refine our definition of happiness, elevate the energy of what brings us happiness. You know, just sort of the question of, should I leave everything and all my responsibilities so I can go off and find God? Maybe yes, but maybe what you're supposed to do is elevate your energy right where you're standing, because that's what finding God is raising and refining your energy, and there's no place where that can't be done. It's always up to us. Everything is just a thing. It depends on how we do it, whether it binds us to delusion or leads us to freedom. Okay?
I just want to ask a question. It's about, like, we already heard that, like, you know, life journey of any person is already written. So
Mhm.
can we change our life?
Question is, a life journey is already written, can we change it? In the context of what we're talking about, certainly, I mean, look at the way we live. What I do today what I do this morning has an effect on the afternoon. What I do this week has an effect on the week after. It's like we can see everywhere that we are affecting our own experience by our own actions. We can also see that we can continually expand our understanding of what's happening, expand our awareness. You know, there was a time when I knew nothing about karma and reincarnation or anything like that, and now my understanding has greatly expanded. There was a time when I thought certain relationships were thus and so, things I didn't know about myself. I was raised in a very intellectual Jewish family. My brother was a debater. He was the state champion debater in the state of Texas, which is real big. So I was 50 before I found out that conversation was not debate. I thought debate was conversation. I mean, that's how we always talked around our table, you know? I mean, like, I was 50 years old before I became aware that people were not inspired when I fiercely laid out all my best arguments and then waited for them to give me theirs. You know, people actually exchange energy and exchange points of view. They don't try to dominate each other like that. But it was like we just keep learning more and more. And as we learn more, we begin to respond differently to life, don't we? So is there any end to that capability of ever learning more and more? And as we learn, become greater and greater awareness, it begins to affect the way we relate to the life around us. Now, whether or not that will change the circumstances of our life, depends on all the karma that has come before, and whether or not continuing in these circumstances will give us the opportunity to continue to expand our awareness, or whether we will have learned all that this can teach us, and then we'll find ourselves moved into something else, or our awareness may grow to the point where we realize that now I have the strength to initiate a change. So in a total abstract way, you know, the law of karma is profoundly misused when it becomes just well, it's just my karma, you know, because then it's just like I don't put out any willpower, I don't have to put any creativity, I just sit here until it runs out. You can just feel when you look at that there's nothing positive about that.
Asha, can you speak a little louder?
Okay.
You're talking directly to her.
Okay. When you behave like that, you can see that you're not learning anything, you're not growing in willpower, you're not growing in understanding. So it's a little bit like the formless question also. It's like we need to ask useful questions, and we need to get useful answers. Clearly, our lives are incredibly intertwined with everything that happened before us and everything going on around us. When I answered this question earlier here in Mumbai, it's like you can't just take your piece of life and cut it out, you know, as if you had no incarnations before and this is completely separate. So you can't just suddenly define it in an unknown way, but to become passive in the face of the fact that there is a lot of momentum. It's more like if you're going down the highway and you're supposed to make a turn and you miss that turn, and you have too much momentum to get back to it, it doesn't mean that you just say, well, I guess I'll just, you know, not visit my mother in the hospital because I missed the turn. You have to put out energy to get yourself back to where you want to be. So when you watch your life unfold, you're often reaping the karma of lifetimes that you no longer remember, but that doesn't mean that you collapse in the face of that momentum. It just means that I have to put out sufficient energy to turn the tide in the direction that I now need it to go. And the effort to do that is why we're here, because the masters have infinite energy and we don't. You know, and this is why you don't want to just take on everything hard, because what we're really trying to do is develop magnetism and momentum that's going in the direction that we want it to go. It's an abstract question, but the day-to-day reality of it is self-evident. Every one of you who has a meditation practice knows life goes better when you meditate. That's why you have a practice. Every one of you who loves God knows that the more you involve the divine in your life, everything goes better. So why you do and why you don't is another one of those abstractions out here. Take those things that are practical, that take you in the direction that you want to go, and then you just leave the bigger questions to someone else. And when it's time for you to know, you'll know. Okay?